Welcome to the France 24 debate. NATO's next step. What future for the alliance with or without America? Trump's defense secretary James Mattis dropped a metaphorical bombshell at the NATO meeting in Brussels. If the rest don't pay more, the US may moderate its commitment. Mattis, who bears the nickname Mad Dog, had earlier stated reassuringly that NATO remained for the US a fundamental bedrock for cooperation. But then came the barb. Mad Dog Mattis barking that NATO states should show support for common defense if they don't want the US to moderate its commitment. Trump, it was, in January, who declared NATO to be obsolete. This raised concern in capitals across the Atlantic that the organisation that had been the bastion of world peace and security for nearly 70 years should be so dismissed by Trump, businessman-in-chief, as some people call him. And Trump's real or virtual links to Russia are raising more and more concern among those states that used to be part of the former Soviet Union, the Baltic countries, fearing suffering the same fate as Ukraine, but perhaps an indifferent USA, led by Trump, looking on. We meet the guests after we go to our correspondent who's been monitoring this NATO meeting for us, Maeve McMahon, who is awaiting us in Brussels. Maeve, give us a taste of what has been said and what people have been saying.
Well, you've got it fairly tight there yourself, Mark. Basically, full assurance today from James Mattis, US Secretary for Defence, that he remains very much committed to the NATO alliance. He called it one of the most successful military alliances in modern history, that it was a fundamental bedrock for the United States, and it had the full backing of the US President Donald Trump. But, he said, this support could wane if member states of the alliance did not pledge and agree to boost more their defence spending when it came to the alliance. He said that for the moment, the United States were paying their lion's share, and he said that only 5 out of the 28 NATO members were reaching the target, which is 2% of annual GDP. Now, James Mattis, as you said, is known among many as a mad dog, but he's also much loved and respected by the US Marines. And that's because he's a straight talker. And he very much used that tone today when he gave a very lengthy intervention in the room. He said that American citizens and taxpayers would not be paying for the freedoms of Westerners, and therefore not be paying for what the Europeans should be pledging money towards and very much paying for. He said that if member states of this alliance, the NATO, could not afford this 2%, that they would just have to set out some sort of a plan or some sort of a timetable in order to do so. He basically said he didn't want to hear any nice words, he wanted action. Now,
Maeve, you were kind enough to tell me that the UK, Estonia, Poland, Greece and the US are the ones who are meeting this 2% threshold that you're talking about. What was the tone around the room when Mattis made that statement about, you know, if people don't cough up, the US may moderate its commitment?
Well, concern, of course, because this is also domestically a pretty tricky issue. Because one thing is the defence ministers here at NATO all nodding around the table and very much agreeing that they want a lot of money to be given to them to look after the area of defence, which they're in charge of. But then they go back to their capitals and go face to face with their finance ministers, and that conversation gets a little bit tricky. It's the finance ministers, of course, who have control over those purse strings. And if you take a country like Germany, a country that was mentioned many times by Donald Trump for not pledging enough to the alliance. It's currently paying 1.5% of its GDP. Well, there's elections coming up in autumn in Germany, and pledging more money towards defence is not something that really wins you voters. So we might have to even wait as long as till at the end of the year to see how Germany decides really to pledge. But most ministers of defence here today were happy to meet a face of the new administration of Donald Trump. They knew, though, however, that James Mattis was a strong defender of NATO. He's worked before as an employee of NATO, and of course he was a US Marine. More telling might be next Monday when Mike Pence comes into town. That's the Vice President of the United States. And of course when Donald Trump himself is here for that big meeting scheduled for the 25th of May.
Busy time ahead for you, Maeve. Thank you very much for briefing us on what happened today in that meeting with Mad Dog Mattis and the rest of NATO. Maeve McMahon, our Brussels correspondent, observing all matters for us there. Let's bring in our guests for our debate here. NATO's next step. What future for the alliance, with or without the US? Joining us by Skype from Tallinn, Estonia, is Molly McHugh, foreign policy consultant and information warfare expert. Molly, good evening to you. We also have by satellite from Washington, D.C., Yasha Munk, who is a lecturer on government at Harvard, author of The People versus Democracy. Thank you, sir, for being with us. I'll bring you in a moment's time. We're expecting another guest joining us from the UK. I'll keep you paused on that one because I won't reveal who it is just yet. Here in the studio, I am pleased to announce we have with us Vice President of the Foundation for Strategic Research, former French ambassador to NATO, 2000 to 2005. We say permanent member, don't we, Benoit? Benoit d'Abouville. Benoit, I will start with you. Abouville, excuse me. I will start with you, sir. When Donald Trump said NATO was obsolete, how did that make you feel?
I thought that we had a long-running dispute in NATO, maybe for 30 years, about burden sharing.
For 30 years?
30 years. President Carter, which was not a real military fan, set the bar much higher. At that time, he asked the NATO 3%. Now we are 2%. Now we have a dispute of whether the Brits are above or under 2%. You have countries like Greece, which are very, very online, but the army is probably not so efficient. So the number of 2% is very useful for the Minister of Defense toward their budget colleague, but it's mean really nothing real, because first, on the high end, you have external operation. For example, France is spending 1.3 billion on the Sahel operation now.
1.3 billion on the operation in North Africa.
Yes. No, of course, it's appear on its spending on the budget, but it is much more concrete than spending 200 million on buying tanks which will stay in garage. Well, second, 2% is basically about manpower. It's why we have introduced, and it was a French proposal, the idea that it will be 20% of the budget of defense will be toward investment, because that is the real meat, if you want. Then you have also some problem like Tallinn, for example. They will spend a lot on police, National Guard, and so forth, because they, given the fact that they may have disruption by the Russian on the minorities and so forth. But that doesn't appear. It is not defense. And doesn't appear. So the real discussion is to establish whether or not the alliance should be an alliance where you have 3 countries which are able to fight, and the other are just making it. And this variable speed alliance is not exactly the solidarity. So
so what the US is calling for is for everybody to be equal and contribute in an equal way.
I think that for the time being there was an electoral kind of demagogic thing. The allies are not spending, and sure. They are not spending on defense, but they are cutting our job through imports. But the real issue is first to have a discussion with the Trump administration, because there has been so many change in position of Trump.
Indeed.
Including Flynn, which depart, and various priorities, terrorism,
I think it's
free trade.
I think with Trump it's a question of getting in the queue and seeing what happens, exactly. And his priorities are very much within the US borders, aren't they?
Yes, and if you say that you want to have a transactional diplomacy, it's incompatible with an alliance, because you don't know. It's a poker game. You don't know so what the partner will do. So I think we should welcome the fact that now and in the following days we will have 3 major American representative of the new administration. So at least we will begin to understand what they want on a reasonable way.
This is the beginning,
not on tweet.
A beginning of a lot of exchange,
Exactly.
not just on Twitter or social
Exactly.
networking. But well, let me pause you there. You mentioned Tallinn. Let's bring in Molly McHugh, who's awaiting us there in the capital of Estonia. Molly, the idea of NATO being obsolete, clearly something that I imagine people where you are might have reacted to in a fairly alarmed way.
I think there were a lot of uncertainties during the campaign and in the early days of the administration about certain statements about NATO and about our commitments to our alliances. I think it's been very reassuring for people, especially in Tallinn and in the Baltic states, to have someone like Secretary Mattis and to have others who sort of continue forward with commitments to the alliance, who are trying to reinvigorate our commitments to the alliance, and who are really trying to point out that, the message from Mattis today to the rest of the defense ministers was very clear, which he was very much laying it out for the allies. We know we're in a war, we know what we need, and it's time to use this crisis as an opportunity to rebuild our alliance for ourselves and for our countries. And he's really trying to present a pathway for the transformative vision and change that we need for the alliance. And I think, as Benoit said in the studio, defense is more complicated than it used to be. I think the war we're in is more complicated. That means defense is more complicated. And if we're talking about cyber war and information war and everything else, then allies should be able to contribute to their defense commitments in different ways. For example, Estonia has been very forward-leaning on cyber defense and on cybersecurity. They've put together a new program to allow their conscripts to serve as sort of cyber conscripts to contribute to cyber defense. There's more creative ways for our allies to contribute to the 2%, to meet the 2%, and to bolster the defense fabric of the alliance. And I think that hopefully you'll see Mattis bringing in some of these ideas, but it's not just about the 2% and about conventional war, although the sort of hard power assets are very important. It's about understanding much more broadly the new security challenging facing our countries and our alliance from terrorism and from other places. And we really need a new vision for how to stand against that.
A new vision, cyber conscripts. It sounds fascinating. Estonia, I'll remind everybody, one of the 5 nations meeting that 2% threshold. Molly, thank you very much. I'll bring you in a few moments' time. Let's go to Washington. Yasha Monk awaiting us from Harvard University. Good evening to you. In terms of what NATO is, I mean, obviously Trump saying it's obsolete, but maybe we don't take him on face value. However, the word does ring and have a resonance. What is your opinion?
The first thing is that Donald Trump has been incredibly irresponsible, and that's obvious. Something like NATO lives off military hard power. It lives off the will of the allies to actually come to each other's defense. But it lives to a very great degree from the expectation that this is going to happen, that there is a deep commitment, especially by the major powers within it, to come to the defense of smaller powers. And so even though Donald Trump has backtracked on saying that NATO is obsolete, even though we're seeing some people like General Mattis sending much better signals, a lot of the damage has already been done. And I think Vladimir Putin will already feel emboldened to experiment on the periphery of NATO in order to see, just how far the alliance is willing to go in order to defend itself. Now, having said all of that, and having pointed out that what Donald Trump is doing and has done is deeply irresponsible, I think that Americans have a point in expecting European allies to spend more on their military. I think there's been a lot of mealy-mouthed making excuses from various European countries, including Germany. Vague commitments to reach 2% of GDP eventually, and it might happen by 2020, it might happen by 2070. And at the moment, when you're thinking about this with a clear conceptual lens from Europe, spending more money on your military is a win-win. Why? Because first of all, with a very realist administration in the United States, if you want people like Donald Trump to care about NATO, to uphold the alliance, then you need to show that you have a big stick to bring to the table and that it's in their interest to have you on their side. And secondly, because I think we now have to face up to the fact that America's commitment to NATO is potentially eroding over time, that Europe might have to defend itself on its own against various forms of Russian aggression. And if you think seriously about that, it implies a great urgency in acquiring the kind of defensive weaponry and the kind of military material you need in order to be safe. We are no longer, as we liked to pretend we were in countries like Germany and France and Italy, surrounded by friends. We now have a pretty hostile power very close to us, and we need to take the consequences from that.
Yasha, thank you very much indeed. I'll bring you back after the break. Let's go to Carl Orton, who I'm pleased to announce has joined us from the United Kingdom. And Carl, I'm told you're in the Wirral, which is an area I know very well, having been born in Liverpool. And can I put this to you? If you were to go onto the streets of Liverpool or Birkenhead or somewhere like Wallasey and say, we're going to spend billions and billions on defence, how do you think people would react?
It would vary. There would inevitably be a chorus of people who would say, oh, that's terrible, you should spend it on hospitals or something. And there would also be, there is a conservative strain in, we can call it the working class, we would have done, that would say, very good, we should have a strong defence. Obviously, as your previous guest has said, it's you can understand the United States' point of view in this because the Americans will go to nuclear war ultimately to protect the allies within NATO. And the NATO allies are being asked to meet only a quite modest defence spending. But at the same time, it's incredibly damaging to have ever said the alliance is obsolete or that he might not honour the United States' commitments to it. They're not the kind of statements you can really properly take back. And that's very worrying, especially since the Russians have already begun with things like Ukraine and with these exercises that attack the Baltics and other states. So it's a very worrying time for the alliance.
Indeed, and they've deployed a cruise missile too, which again is another issue which is making people sit up and take notice. Carl, thanks for joining us. Pausing you there. Thanks to all the guests for the first half of this debate. Stay with us. So much more to come after a very short break.